What if the country everyone assumed was just absorbing missiles for 4 years just proved it can hit back harder, deeper, and faster than anyone expected? 66 targets, 48 hours. And almost none of it happened where the world was watching. Before we go further, here's a quick ask. If breakdowns like this help you actually understand the war, instead of just watching clips out of context, hit subscribe, tap like, and send this to someone who still thinks this conflict is stuck in a stalemate. It takes 5 seconds, and it genuinely helps this channel keep making videos like this one. Now, let's get into what actually happened. In the middle of August 2026, Russia launched one of its heaviest assaults on Kyiv in months. Ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and swarms of attack drones tore through the night sky over the Ukrainian capital for hours. Residential buildings were hit, a crowded book market went up in flames. People were killed and wounded in their own homes, far from any front line. Russian officials framed it as a strike against military infrastructure. The reality on the ground looked very different. Apartment blocks reduced to rubble, families pulled from wreckage, a city forced once again to spend a night sheltering underground, listening for the next wave overhead. This wasn't an isolated night either. Reports from Russia's own Ministry of Defense described one of the largest waves of Ukrainian drone strikes deep inside Russian territory in the same window. Hundreds of drones converging on targets stretching from the Moscow region all the way down toward the Russian south. Two very different countries, two very different capitals, both absorbing the kind of night that used to be rare and has now become almost routine. It's worth pausing on just how unusual that pairing actually is, even against the backdrop of a war that's been running since early 2022. For years, the pattern of this conflict felt relatively predictable to outside observers. Russia launched large-scale missile and drone barrages against Ukrainian cities, and Ukraine largely absorbed those attacks while fighting a grinding, attritional battle along a relatively fixed front line. Deep strikes into Russian territory happened, but for a long stretch of the war they were sporadic, smaller in scale, and treated more as occasional headline events than a sustained strategic pillar. What's shifted over the past year, and especially in recent months, is the frequency and scale of Ukraine's own long-range campaign, to the point where nights featuring hundreds of Ukrainian drones penetrating deep into Russian airspace have become a recurring feature of this war, rather than a rare exception. But it's what came next that deserves real attention, because it reveals something about how this war has quietly transformed. Ukraine did not simply defend and rebuild. Within days, its forces launched a coordinated deep strike campaign that reportedly hit dozens of targets scattered across Russian-occupied territory and Russian soil itself. Fighter jets, radar systems, vessels tied to Russia's sanctions evasion network, and infrastructure that keeps the Russian war machine supplied. According to Ukraine's own unmanned systems forces, the operation struck around 66 separate targets in under 2 days. Whatever the exact final tally turns out to be, once independent verification catches up, the scale alone marks a meaningful shift in how this war is being fought. To understand why this moment matters, you need to understand what Ukraine was actually going after, because these weren't random targets picked to generate headlines. Among the sites reportedly hit were fighter jets stationed at Russian air bases, far from the front line, aircraft that had been providing air cover and hunting Ukrainian, drones over Russia's own southern airspace. Losing combat aircraft on your own soil, in bases that are supposed to be safe, sends a very different message than losing them in contested territory near the fighting. It tells your own Air Force that nowhere is guaranteed to be secure anymore. Alongside the aircraft, reports pointed to strikes on vessels tied to what's often called Russia's shadow fleet, ships that move oil and other cargo while dodging international sanctions through flag switching, disabled tracking systems, and murky ownership structures. These vessels matter enormously to Russia's war economy because they're one of the main ways Moscow keeps oil revenue flowing despite years of sanctions pressure. Hitting that network doesn't just damage a ship, it chips away at the financial plumbing that keeps the broader war funded. It's worth understanding at just how central that shadow fleet has become to Russia's ability to keep fighting at all. When major Western sanctions cut off much of Russia's access to conventional shipping insurance and tanker registries, Moscow didn't simply lose that revenue stream. It built an entire parallel infrastructure to route around it. Older tankers, often nearing the end of their operational lifespan, were bought up, reflagged under countries with minimal oversight, and put back into service, carrying Russian oil to buyers willing to look past the murky paperwork. That workaround has kept billions of dollars flowing despite years of sanctions pressure. Every vessel removed from that network, whether sunk, damaged, or simply taken out of rotation, represents a small but real dent in a financial lifeline Russia has spent years carefully constructing. If this kind of grounded breakdown is useful to you, do me a favor. Drop a comment with one word describing how you think this war has changed over the past year. I read these, and it genuinely shapes what I dig into next. Now let's talk about the part of this operation that might matter most in the long run, radar systems. Reports described strikes on multiple radar installations across Russian-occupied Crimea and nearby Russian regions, the kind of early warning and tracking systems that feed targeting data to surface to air. Missile batteries. Radar might not sound as dramatic as a burning fighter jet, but in modern warfare, it's arguably more important. A missile battery without functioning radar is close to useless, no matter how advanced its interceptors are. Take out the eyes of an air defense network, and everything behind those eyes becomes far easier to reach. That's the strategic logic worth sitting with here. Military planners sometimes describe this kind of campaign as opening the sky, systematically blinding and disabling the sensors and defenses protecting a region so that everything behind that shield becomes vulnerable to follow-up strikes. If Ukraine really has been chipping away at Russian air defense coverage over Crimea and the surrounding areas in a sustained way, that's not just a single dramatic night of destruction. It's the groundwork for sustained pressure that could make an entire region increasingly difficult for Russia to defend and resupply going forward. Think of it less like a single knockout blow and more like methodically removing the nervous system from a much larger body before targeting anything else. Tank, a jet, or a missile launcher without functioning radar and early warning coverage becomes far easier to locate, track, and eventually destroy. That's why radar and air defense infrastructure tends to top the target list in any serious deep strike campaign, even when the resulting explosions look less dramatic on camera than a burning fighter jet or sinking tanker. The payoff isn't immediate destruction, it's the vulnerability that opens up afterward for every strike that follows. There's also a broader campaign underneath this specific 52-hour window. That's worth understanding because it didn't come out of nowhere. Throughout the summer of 2026, Ukraine has significantly expanded its long-range strike capacity, hitting targets that would have seemed unreachable earlier in the war. Oil refineries deep inside Russian territory, hundreds and sometimes over 1,000 kilometers from the front line, have been repeatedly struck. Facilities in regions like Samara and Perm, places most people outside Russia had never heard of before this war, have become recurring names in this story, hit again and again by drone strikes, targeting the specific processing units that turn crude oil into usable jet fuel and diesel. That distinction matters more than it might seem at first. Russia sits on enormous underground oil reserves, but crude oil in the ground doesn't power a tank or a fighter jet. It has to be refined first, and refining capacity is a much narrower bottleneck than raw oil supply. By targeting the processing units inside these refineries, rather than simply trying to destroy oil in storage, Ukrainian strikes have aimed at the exact choke point that actually constrains how much usable fuel reaches the front line. Reports have described specific units responsible for a large share of a facility's total output being knocked offline for weeks at a time, a slow, grinding form of pressure that doesn't make for a single dramatic headline but compounds month after month. It helps to think about why this approach is so much more efficient than simply trying to destroy stockpiles of finished fuel. Storage tanks can be rebuilt relatively quickly, and stockpiles can be replenished from elsewhere. A specialized refining unit, on the other hand, is a complex piece of industrial equipment that often takes months to repair or replace, sometimes requiring parts and expertise that have become harder to source under years of sanctions restricting Russia's access to certain Western industrial technology. Every strike on one of these processing units isn't just a single night's disruption, it's a multi-week or multi-month dent in how much usable fuel that facility can produce, which ripples outward into everything from military logistics to the price ordinary Russians pay at the pump. Before we keep going, here's something a little different. If you've made it this far, you clearly want more than a surface-level summary. So hit subscribe now if you haven't already, because that's exactly the kind of depth this channel is built around. Let's continue. It isn't only fuel infrastructure that's been targeted either. Ukrainian strikes have also hit logistics and warehouse facilities tied to Russia's civilian economy, including massive distribution centers that, while not military installations in the traditional sense, form part of the broader supply chain, keeping goods, equipment, and materials moving across Russian territory. Modern militaries don't survive purely on weapons and ammunition. They depend on functioning logistics networks, transport, warehousing, distribution, and supply routes that keep everything else moving. Disrupting that web, even the parts that look civilian on the surface, has become a deliberate part of Ukraine's broader strategy to grind down Russia's capacity to sustain the war over the long term. This is where the story gets genuinely strategic rather than just tactical, because for most of this war, Russia's sheer size was treated as one of its greatest natural advantages. A country spanning 11 time zones, with military and industrial facilities scattered thousands of kilometers from the nearest Ukrainian border, seemed almost impossible to threaten directly. Distance meant safety. It meant refineries and factories could operate without constant fear of attack. and commanders could plan logistics without treating every facility as a potential target. That assumption shaped years of Russian military planning. That assumption also shaped decisions made long before this war even began, when Russian planners positioned key industrial and military infrastructure across the country with an implicit understanding that only a handful of the most sophisticated militaries in the world could ever realistically threaten targets that far from any conceivable front line. Refineries were built for efficiency and proximity to resources, not for defensibility against a determined drone campaign. Air bases hosting valuable aircraft were placed based on operational convenience, not because anyone seriously planned for the possibility that a neighboring country's drone fleet might one day be able to reach them. That entire framework of assumptions is what's now being tested in real time. What this latest wave of strikes demonstrates, alongside the broader campaign building up to it, is that assumption no longer holds the way it once did. Long-range drones with the reach to travel hundreds, sometimes well over 1,000 kilometers, have effectively shrunk the map. Facilities that once felt untouchably far from the war are now recurring targets. That doesn't mean Russia's size no longer matters at all. A country that vast still has real defensive advantages, but it does mean the specific comfort of geographic distance, the idea that certain regions were simply too far away to worry about, has eroded significantly. There's a resource math problem underneath all of this too, and it's worth walking through carefully because it explains why volume matters as much as precision in this kind of campaign. Air defense systems are expensive, limited in number, and have to be positioned somewhere specific to be useful. A country can build and deploy plenty of interceptors, but it cannot place enough of them to fully protect every airbase, every refinery, every warehouse, every port, and every command center simultaneously across a landmass the size of Russia. Something always has to be prioritized, which inevitably means something else gets left comparatively exposed. To put that scale in perspective, Russia's territory stretches across roughly 17 million square kilometers, spanning 11 separate time zones. Even a country with a large, well-funded air defense industry cannot manufacture and deploy enough radar coverage and interceptor batteries to blanket a landmass that size evenly. Choices have to be made about which regions, which industries, and which specific facilities get priority protection, and every one of those choices is, by definition, a decision to leave something else comparatively undefended. That's not a criticism of Russian military planning specifically. It's simply the physical reality facing any country trying to defend a territory that enormous against a determined and expanding drone campaign. Now, scale that dilemma up with the sheer number of drones Ukraine has been sending across the border in recent months. Russian officials themselves have reported shooting down hundreds of drones in single overnight waves, sometimes describing them among the largest aerial attacks Kyiv has launched throughout the entire war. When attack numbers climb into the hundreds on a regular basis, air defense doesn't just face a technical challenge, it faces an economic one. Every intercepted drone still costs an interceptor missile that isn't cheap to replace, and every wave that gets through, even partially, forces defenders to make uncomfortable choices about which facilities get protected and which ones are simply left to absorb whatever gets through. That economic asymmetry is worth dwelling on for a moment, because it's arguably the single most important structural feature of this entire drone campaign. Many of the drones being used in these long-range strikes are relatively inexpensive to produce, compared to the sophisticated interceptor missiles typically used to shoot them down. When one side can manufacture attack drones for a fraction of the cost of the defensive systems used against them, that side gains a lasting structural advantage, simply by sustaining the tempo of attacks over time. It doesn't need to overwhelm every single defense system in one dramatic night. It only needs to keep the pressure high enough, consistently enough, that the cost of defending against it slowly becomes unsustainable for the other side to maintain indefinitely. If you're finding this useful, here's a different kind of ask. Tell me in the comments which part of this campaign you think matters more in the long run, the strikes on fighter jets and radar, or the strikes on refineries and logistics, because I genuinely think reasonable people disagree on that, and I want to hear where you land before we get into what comes next. It's worth being honest about what we don't fully know here too, because a story like this deserves some caution alongside the analysis. Specific casualty figures, exact damage assessments, and precise numbers on how many strikes actually reached their intended targets versus how many were intercepted are difficult to verify independently in real time, especially when much of the reporting comes from military sources on either side with an obvious interest in shaping the narrative. Ukraine has strong reasons to publicize the successful strikes as proof that its long-range strategy is working. Russia has equally strong reasons to downplay losses and emphasize how many drones its air defenses intercepted. The truth, as usual in a war like this, likely sits somewhere between the most triumphant version of events and the most dismissive one. This is exactly the kind of situation where healthy skepticism serves viewers better than blind acceptance of any single source's framing. A claimed number like 66 targets destroyed in 48 hours deserves to be treated as a reported figure from an interested party, not an independently confirmed fact carved in stone. That doesn't mean dismissing it outright either. Military claims in this war have, over time, often proven directionally accurate, even when exact figures later needed adjustment. The more useful approach is watching whether claims like this one get corroborated by satellite imagery, independent open source analysts, or admissions from the other side over the following days and weeks, rather than either accepting or rejecting them the moment they're announced. What does seem clear, though, based on the pattern across the summer, rather than any single night alone, is the direction this campaign is heading. Ukraine's ability to strike deep inside Russian territory has expanded meaningfully compared to where it stood earlier in the war. The range has grown, the frequency has grown, and the categories of targets being hit: military, air bases, radar networks, refineries, logistics hubs, and vessels tied to sanctions evasion cover nearly every layer of what keeps a modern war machine functioning. That breadth matters as much as any individual strike because it suggests a deliberate layered strategy rather than scattered opportunistic hits. There's also a psychological dimension to all of this that's easy to overlook if you only focus on hardware and statistics. For a large part of this war, the conflict felt geographically contained for many people living inside Russia, something happening at the front, something covered on state television, something that touched soldiers and their families directly but rarely disrupted daily life in cities far from Ukraine's borders. As long-range strikes reach further into Russian territory, hitting fuel depots, warehouses, and refineries in regions that had felt insulated from the war, that sense of distance starts to erode. Explosions, fires, and disrupted supply chains in places that were previously just names on a map begin to feel closer, more immediate, harder to ignore. And there's also something to be said about how quickly a population can recalibrate its sense of safety once that pattern repeats enough times. A single isolated strike on a distant facility might be dismissed as an unlucky one-off. A pattern of repeated strikes across multiple regions, month after month, is much harder to wave away as an anomaly. That repetition is precisely what shifts public perception over time, not any individual dramatic night, but the slow accumulation of evidence that no region is quite as insulated as it once seemed. That psychological shift matters because public sentiment inside Russia has been quietly shifting for a while now, independent of any single strike. Polling from Russia's respected independent Levada Center has shown a clear and growing majority, consistently above 60% in recent surveys, in favor of moving toward peace negotiations rather than continuing the war. Support for actually continuing military operations, by contrast, has fallen to some of its lowest recorded levels since the war began. That doesn't mean most Russians have turned against their own military or the broader narrative around the war. Polling also shows continued strong approval, for the armed forces specifically. But it does suggest a population increasingly exhausted by a conflict now well into its fourth year, one that many hoped would have ended by now. It's worth being precise about what that polling actually shows, because it's easy to overstate it in either direction. A majority wanting to move toward negotiations is not the same as a majority actively protesting in the streets or demanding an immediate unconditional end to the war on any terms. Russian public opinion remains a complicated, layered thing, shaped by state media, genuine patriotism, war fatigue, and a political environment where openly criticizing the war carries real personal risk. Still, the direction of that sentiment, war weariness climbing steadily as this conflict grinds into its fifth year, forms an important backdrop to understand why sustained strikes on Russia's own territory carry weight beyond their immediate military impact. It's also worth noting how this sentiment tends to interact with visible disruptions specifically, rather than abstract news coverage. Polling and public commentary consistently suggest that Russians report far more concern about the war when it affects their own daily routines directly, fuel shortages, delayed shipments, local infrastructure disruptions, than when they simply hear about distant battlefield developments on state television. That distinction helps explain why a strike campaign specifically targeting fuel processing, logistics, and supply chains carries a different kind of weight than purely front-line military engagements. It's not just about degrading Russia's war-fighting capacity in the abstract. It's about making the war tangible and disruptive in places that had, until recently, felt entirely insulated from it. Meanwhile, Russia hasn't been standing still either. Manpower has become an increasingly visible strain, with reports describing growing difficulty finding new recruits and a shrinking pool of soldiers as losses mount on the front. The pressure feeds back Into the broader picture painted here, a military simultaneously trying to sustain offensive operations in Ukraine, defend an enormous stretch of territory against expanding long-range strikes, and manage a domestic population growing more openly tired of a war with no clear end date in sight. This manpower strain shows up in ways that go well beyond battlefield statistics. Reports throughout the summer have described recruitment efforts increasingly targeting older men, people with limited or no prior military training, and populations that would not have been considered priority candidates for service earlier in the war. That shift is rarely announced directly. It tends to surface through regional reporting, leaked recruitment documents, and accounts from families describing unexpected summons. Whatever the precise scale of this trend turns out to be, its existence at all tells you something important about how stretched the system managing troop numbers has become after more than 4 years of continuous fighting. A military doesn't broaden its recruitment pool this aggressively when its existing pipeline is working comfortably. There's also a quieter economic dimension running underneath all of this that connects directly back to the refinery and logistics strikes described earlier. Every disrupted fuel supply chain, every damaged warehouse, every sanctioned tanker pulled out of rotation adds friction to an economy that has already been running on a wartime footing for years. Russian officials have publicly acknowledged budget pressures tied to the cost of sustaining this conflict, even while continuing to project confidence about the country's overall economic resilience. Sustained strikes on the specific infrastructure that keeps fuel, goods, and revenue moving compound that pressure gradually rather than all at once, the kind of slow economic erosion that rarely makes for a dramatic headline but adds up significantly over years rather than months. Put all of this together, and you start to see why this particular 52-hour window matters beyond its own immediate news cycle. It wasn't simply a retaliatory strike after a brutal night of missiles over Kiev, though that timing certainly carries emotional weight. It was another data point in a much longer pattern, Ukraine methodically expanding its ability to reach deep into Russian territory, targeting the layers that actually sustain a modern military: fuel, logistics, air defense, and the financial networks funding it all. None of that guarantees a swift end to this war. Wars this large and this entrenched rarely end because of any single operation, no matter how successful. But it does suggest the balance of who can credibly threaten whom has shifted further than most casual coverage of this conflict tends to acknowledge. It's worth stepping back for a moment and asking what this all means for how the rest of the world should be thinking about this war, because the framing matters. For a long stretch of this conflict, the dominant narrative outside Ukraine treated the country as fundamentally reactive, absorbing missile barrages, defending its cities, holding front lines under enormous pressure, while Russia held the initiative in terms of where and when major offensive action happened. That framing was never entirely fair, even in the earlier years of the war, but it was understandable, given the scale of destruction Ukrainian cities were absorbing night after night. What campaigns like this one complicate is the idea that initiative only flows in one direction. A country capable of reaching refineries 1,000 kilometers behind the front line, disabling radar networks, protecting occupied territory, and striking fighter jets on their own runways is not a country purely on the defensive, regardless of how the broader war is framed in daily headlines. So where does this actually leave things going forward? Watch whether Ukraine's long-range strikes on Russian refineries and logistics continue at this pace, or whether this particular window turns out to be an unusually intense spike rather than a new baseline. Watch how Russian air defense adapts, whether it manages to concentrate coverage more effectively around its most critical facilities, or whether the sheer scale of these drone waves continues to outpace what any single country's air defense network can realistically cover. And watch how Russian public sentiment continues evolving as strikes keep reaching further into places that once felt safely distant from the war, because that shift in perception may end up mattering just as much as any single military target destroyed in a single night. Watch, too, whether Ukraine's Western partners respond to this kind of expanding deep strike capability with more support or with caution about how far this campaign should be allowed to reach. That external dimension shapes everything else discussed here, because Ukraine's long-range strike capacity, however impressive it has become, still depends heavily on components, intelligence sharing, and political tolerance from allies who have their own competing considerations about escalation risk. A campaign like this one doesn't exist in a vacuum. It exists inside a broader web of alliances, funding decisions, and diplomatic calculations that could either accelerate this trend or slow it down considerably in the months ahead. There's something worth remembering here that goes beyond the specific numbers, the specific locations, and the specific hardware involved in any of this. Wars are ultimately tests of endurance, as much as they are tests of firepower. A country can win individual battles and still lose the broader war if it cannot sustain the economic and logistical weight of fighting one indefinitely. What this latest wave of strikes suggests, layered on top of a summer of expanding long-range attacks, is that Ukraine has increasingly shifted its strategy toward exactly that kind of endurance test, not simply defending its own cities night after night, but steadily raising the cost of the war for the country that started it, in places its leadership once assumed were untouchable. That shift toward an endurance-based strategy also says something about how Ukraine itself may be thinking about the years ahead, not just the weeks. A rapid, decisive breakthrough that ends this war in a single dramatic campaign has looked increasingly unlikely for a long stretch of this conflict, given the scale of fortifications, manpower, and industrial capacity on both sides. What remains available, and what this pattern of strikes increasingly reflects, is a strategy built around sustained pressure over time, steadily raising the economic and logistical cost of continuing the war until the calculation in Moscow shifts, rather than banking everything on a single knockout blow that may never arrive. If you've made it this far into the video, you already understand this war at a level most quick headlines never get close to. So here's my last ask for today. Subscribe if you want this channel, tracking exactly how this campaign develops in the weeks ahead, and drop a comment telling me whether you think Russia can adapt its air defense fast enough to blunt this pressure, or whether this kind of deep strike campaign only keeps expanding from here. Whatever happens next, one thing already feels certain. The old assumption that distance alone could keep a war contained, that some regions were simply too far from the front line to ever feel its consequences, no longer holds the way it once did. 66 targets in 48 hours is a striking number on its own. But the deeper story isn't really about that single number, it's about what it represents. A war that has quietly stopped respecting the borders either side once assumed would protect them, and a conflict now being fought as much in refineries, warehouses, and radar stations, far from any trench, as it is on the front line itself.